There's TV.
Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan. I'm the Executive Director here at the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We are so glad that you have joined us. As you know, the purpose of our show is to talk about the lives and experiences of women. We talk about gender-based violence, women involved in human trafficking. We talk about mental health. We talk about addictions. We talk about women in leadership and decision-making. And so we're always thankful that you, our community, comes alongside us to have these conversations. Before we begin, we do want to recognize and thank our Indigenous community. We thank you for your culture and traditions. We thank you for allowing us to have these conversations here on these traditional lands. We want to learn and we want to be allies. And so we just thank you for your teaching and just embracing our partnerships with you. Thank you. So we're glad that you've joined us because we are continuing on in a three-part series with regards to learning about trauma, a trauma-informed approach or lens, and how that impacts behavior and how we just create awareness and understanding in our community. So I'm usually the one asking the questions, but I am thrilled to be joined by Deb James, our Community Development Manager here at the shelter. And Deb is going to be asking me the questions today again as we continue our conversation about trauma. So Deb, welcome and thank you. And I'm going to throw it back over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you again for bringing me in on this. I just love the conversation, and I think it's very important to talk about trauma. Let's just start, I guess, with the last show and just a quick little recap about trauma, maybe some of the different kinds of trauma, and then we can kind of move forward from there.
Great. So just a very, very brief overview, and I encourage anybody who's watching to go back and watch this from the beginning, the first show, so you can get the fullness of that discussion. So we were talking about trauma, and in summary, that we all carry trauma. I encourage you to go back and watch this series from the very first one so you can get the fullness of that conversation. But in summary, we were talking about trauma and what it means to be trauma-informed or to have a trauma-informed lens towards other people. And so 75 to 80% of Canadians have had one experience of trauma, and many of us have had more than one. And trauma means that we've had an experience in our life that can be seen as major or minor in the eyes of other people. But how we define that trauma is the most important thing. So something that happens to me might seem huge, but in Deb's eyes, it may seem pretty minor. And that just speaks to how I have learned or not learned how to deal with my own trauma. And so trauma can look very different for all of us. It's very much on a spectrum, and it's very much builds on each event. So if I've had multiple traumas in my life, my coping is probably not going to be at its best because they build and build and build on each other, right? And how I cope with that trauma is going to be based on my upbringing, how I learned to deal with difficulties, my resiliency, my self-confidence. Different examples of trauma can include vicarious trauma. So I work with somebody who has a traumatic experience and it lands on me. I go home at the end of the day and I'm thinking about their experience as if it's my own. That says that I haven't dealt with my own trauma to be able to help that other person. We can talk about intergenerational trauma, systemic trauma, historical trauma. I use the example of residential schools. Think about the Indigenous experience, having lands removed from that community, having children taken away and placed in residential schools. We still hear and know that for children, grandchildren of folks that were in that residential school system are still carrying the trauma of their grandparents and parents. That is intergenerational and historical trauma. And we also talk about developmental trauma, the importance of meeting the needs of infants and children when they are stressed, when they are crying, when they are hungry, as parents and caregivers, to be responsive to those needs. Because if we don't, it actually changes and can change what the brain looks like. It teaches that young child that they cannot depend on somebody who is supposed to be helping them with their needs. And what that means is that young child grows up into an adult and has no definition or idea what a healthy relationship looks like, of caring, mutual respect, right? And taking care of each other when things are difficult. And of course, what we talked about was seeing women coming into the shelter with young children. And then as adults, we see those young children coming into the shelter again. Very generational, very developmental, because those children have not, the cycle of violence has not been broken for them. And so trauma carries throughout generations. So that is a very quick down and dirty summary of, kind of what we talked about in the first show. And again, we do encourage you to check out that first show so that you can see the fullness of that conversation. But it is important that we all have an understanding of trauma, because we interact with people in the community all the time. Within our own families, we will have people who have experienced trauma and might be stuck in that trauma.
Okay, so I've got my lens on, I've got my glasses, I'm starting to think about trauma, and perhaps, and I'm interacting with somebody. I'm really now starting to bring that into how I think about things. What are some of the things that I might be seeing, like a reaction to trauma, like behaviors associated with a traumatic, something traumatic?
So we're going to talk about how trauma influences behavior. And I do want to just highlight too, which was part of our last conversation. We can pass a lot of judgment and shame on people who use drugs and substances, alcohol, folks who are unhoused. We can have a lot of judgment towards their use and how people may be living their lives. What we want to try and do in this series is to build an understanding of respect, dignity, compassion, empathy for people who might be in those situations of drug use, homelessness, from a trauma lens. How can we look at them and their life situation with an understanding that they've experienced trauma? And so one of the responses in terms of behavior that people will show us is that they might make decisions that we know are unhealthy for them, that they probably know are unhealthy for them, but they don't feel like they have any other options. So there are people who've had so much trauma in their lives that they don't see any other way of coping. And, drug use can be a way of dulling the pain, masking the pain, because it is far too great to open up and to try and deal with, right? And I mean, mental health, there's so many folks who are struggling with mental health, right? And when you start to talk to folks, what they can tell you is about the incredible trauma that they've experienced. So I want to preface, our conversation about why we're doing this is to try and build our own understanding and compassion for people in our community and for each other, anyone, right? And so when we talk about how trauma influences behavior, there's really four main responses. So those are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so when I am faced with a traumatic experience, I might pull from one of those four or a multiple of those four. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with that. And I mean, we're all going to learn and we're all going to deal with trauma in some way. There can very much be healthy aspects to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So there's positive, but there can also be negative. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And I'm going to just start maybe with talking about one, and we'll see how far we get. But I want to start to talk about fight. And so fight is very much driven by self-preservation. I'm faced with something traumatic that's coming at me, something that I can see it's going to happen. I'm walking down the street at night by myself and somebody starts running towards me, I'm scared. I'm by myself and I don't know what I'm going to do. So I have an opportunity here to pull out some kind of a response, right? What is my behavior going to be in response to this traumatic thing that I feel is happening to me, right? So if we think about a fight response, self-preservation, safety, what should my response be? So think about it. I'm going to set boundaries for myself. I am not going to put myself in a situation that might cause me harm, an unknown, risky situation, right? I'm going to be confident in the decision that I make. That is me exercising my fight response, right? What would probably be an unhealthy response in terms of that fight response would be turning around and starting to yell at that person that is running towards me. Probably not a good idea, right? That fight response is not appropriate, is not the best outlet for me. What I need to be doing is thinking about, how do I create safety for myself and what does that look like? I'm going to cross the street and I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to pull out my phone and have it ready to dial if something untoward starts to happen to me. But I'm also going to cross the street and I'm going to keep on walking without the assumption that I'm in danger. I'm going to be aware and I'm going to be, evaluating my risk, but I am not going to do anything at that point until I actually know that I am at risk, right? It's good for us to be self-aware, good for us to be mindful of our safety, but also good not to make assumptions that something bad is going to happen to us. And again, if I think about the discussions that we've had about trauma, if you are somebody that has had a traumatic experience, let's say that you've been attacked or you've had somebody come up to you and start yelling at you, if that is me and I'm that person walking down the street and I see somebody running towards me, my traumatic response is probably going to kick in big time because I've had that previous experience. Trying to teach ourselves that we have confidence in how we can deal with these situations is vitally important, right? We're all going to be faced with traumatic things that could potentially happen to us. So a fight response is just one of the responses that we're looking at, right? And we are going to look at the other three. But, a fight response can also look different as well. And I'll just give you a couple more examples, like demanding perfection from other people can be a fight response, right? Having anger towards other people, controlling or bullying others can also be an example of a fight response, right? And so how we grew up, how we learned how to deal with trauma is going to predict our behavior in response to trauma. And so I know we're going to, be heading into a commercial shortly, but when we do come back, we're going to dive more into those other responses, right? And so again, there are 4: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And we're all going to fit somewhere into those categories when we are dealing with a traumatic experience.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a very short break. It's Educate Inform Challenge. Teresa MacLennan is normally on the other seat and is asking the questions, but today I am asking the questions. We're talking trauma-informed lens and training and practice, and really diving into our responses to trauma. We'll be right back on Rogers TV.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
This is a brain in urgent need of mental health care. But because 3 out of every 4 Indigenous people experience racism in healthcare, she may not get the help she needs. Become an ally. Rise above racism in healthcare.
I Santa here, reminding you that Talk to Santa's coming back to Rogers TV on December 13th, 14th, 15th, and the 18th. Give us a call and we'll chat.
Welcome back to Educate Inform Challenge on Rogers TV. I'm Deb James with Teresa MacLennan. It's a little bit of a role reversal today. Normally Teresa asks the questions, but I'm asking Teresa today. This is a three-part series on trauma and trauma-informed training. This is content and training that we actually have through the shelter that we've been offering to the community. And we just thought it was such a great opportunity to bring it to the Rogers TV audience as well. So just before the break, we were talking about kind of those responses, behaviors and responses to trauma. We got started with fight, and you were going to go through some of the other responses that we often see.
So we all experience trauma. We're interacting with people in the community, our families, our friends, and they've experienced trauma. And when that happens to us, we kind of pull from four main responses in our behavior to trauma. So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The four Fs is, what we like to call that in terms of trauma. And we did talk about fight. So I'm faced with a traumatic experience and I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight back to it. I'm going to get heightened. I'm going to get revved up in my response, right? And again, just to preface that any one of these responses can also be healthy and can be unhealthy, right? And so we've already talked about that fight response and the healthy and the unhealthy. So the other one I want to talk about is flight. And so we're faced with a traumatic experience and there's something critical that's happening for us. And our response may be flight. I'm going to leave that situation. Well, you know what? That's a very healthy response, right? If you are faced with something that seems untoward, it is risky, it's unhealthy, it is unsafe for you, removing ourselves from that potentially harmful situation can be a really good idea. Why not think about your safety and remove ourselves from the situation instead of staying and fighting with that situation? So flight can be very, very healthy. Where we see a flight response being unhealthy is in someone's just overall inability to handle anything, really. They cannot deal or handle any kind of conflict. There's no conflict resolution skills whatsoever. Difference of opinion that somebody has with that person, they can't handle it. And what ends up happening is that person will purposely avoid people and situations because they just are unable to cope. And what happens then is that person really is impacted in the ability to form healthy relationships with others. I invite you over for dinner and, every time you say no. And that's going to impact our friendship. Can I have the understanding that because of your own trauma, your own difficulties, mental health, can I understand that you're just not able to do it? Yes. But it is going to probably impact our relationship, right? Because what kind of a relationship is there if we can never spend time together, right? So people will do a flight response a lot because they are just unable to cope, right? Or we can also see people hold that thought, Deb, being very obsessed or compulsive behavior in terms of flight, right? So there's a feeling of panic and anxiety all of the time. Yeah. Deb, what did you want to say?
I was going to say, I think we see the flight response in the shelter a lot, and right after a woman might come into the shelter, and with whatever's gone down and whatever's there are a lot of women who just shut down and can't deal for a period of time, and we do see that quite a bit.
Absolutely. We might be having a conversation with a woman and a lot of times a woman will say something that opens the door, hopefully, to further conversation and healing about her experience of violence. But just because she opens the door doesn't mean that she's in any way ready to have a conversation with us. Sometimes they just drop hints or little seeds to conversations, but that doesn't mean that they want to engage in a full-fledged conversation about it, because they are just not in the place to be able to do that, right? And so very much there's a complete shutdown, and we do see that a lot for the women and the children too, right? And of course, we're here, we want to help them, we want to have conversation with them, we really want to walk beside them through this journey of healing, but we have to be where she is at. We can't force it, we don't direct it. We really do start with her leading us and directing us in terms of what she's ready for. But you are absolutely right. Women just need to shut down quite a bit, because the wounds are too much. They're too heavy. They're too deep, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it is really just about what kind of coping strategies can we help you with, just to be able to survive and continue on with life, right? So it's a really good point that you brought up, Deb. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Another response is freeze. And I think that this is very much also in line with what we were just talking about with women in the shelter, right? So, freezing can be healthy as well. It means that we can be in the moment and really assessing what is happening around us and to us before making any kind of quick decisions, right? So we're taking time to reflect and we're responding in a healthy way. So taking a moment or freezing can be very healthy, but sometimes it is not, right? When we are unable to move because of fear, when we cannot make decisions because of fear, we can't take any kind of action, we're immobile. We are frozen. We are frozen in our response because of the trauma that we've experienced, right? We can't make a decision, and we're afraid to, because we're afraid that it might be the wrong one. And, if you carry a traumatic experience, and let's say you've made, a decision before, and that kind of situation creeps up in your life again, you're going to be hesitant to make that same decision, right? And that's good learning for all of us. But for some folks, those decisions have not turned out well. And so when they're faced with a similar situation and they need to make a decision, they can't. They're afraid, right? Like, I think about, okay, I'm thinking about making a career change, and I'm going to leave the job that I'm in right now, and I'm going to jump ship, and I'm going to go somewhere else. So let's say I do that, and I go to that other place, and it's terrible. It was awful. I didn't like it, and I regret the decision that I made. An opportunity may come up for me to try a different career, and somebody is saying, hey, come on over with us. I might be frozen in being able to make that decision because I've been burned. I'm afraid. I don't want to make that decision, right? And it is really based on the experience that I had, but I might be very frozen in being able to make a decision and a response, right? And that is just how that can happen for so many women that come into our shelter as well. They have had a difficult relationship, and we do see this because women will come back to us when they are starting to think about having and stepping into another relationship. They are so afraid that it's going to be another abusive relationship. How will I see the red signs, the red flags that this person is going to be another abuser, right? They're frozen. And they may be missing out in an opportunity to have a really healthy, great relationship. But because of trauma, because of the, experience that they had before, they're not going to step into it. They're not going to risk it, right? And so, part of our work is to help women with that, right?
I really can see how a woman could get stuck in that place and just, be constantly re-triggered, and just constantly stuck there.
And then the last response I want to talk about, which can be a relatively new one for people to think about, is Fawn. And Fawn is very much like freeze. It can be a response. It can be a combination of all of the traumatic responses that we've talked about. But Fawn is very much driven by people pleasing. I'm going to use this language, which is not language that I use very often, but, being a doormat to other people, right? Where a person almost seems like they've just crumbled and they have no self-confidence, they have no self-awareness, they have no skills of coping, whatsoever. And, in some ways, Fawn can be healthy because you are very much taking a step back. You're actively listening to other people. You can show compassion. You can compromise, right? That can be some good elements of that Fawn response. What we see in terms of a Fawn response with the women and the kids that we support is, again, I use that language of being a doormat, that people can walk all over that person, right? The person is too accommodating, too compromising, right? Saying yes to all of the things that person is asked, of, like, even in the workplace, think about people that they're asked to do things and they always say yes. And I always say, if you always say yes, your no has no worth, right? We have to learn how to say no, right? But people who fawn are very much about pleasing people. I'm going to say yes, I'm going to take it on, to their own detriment, because they're ignoring their own feelings. In their head, they might be saying, I can't take anything on and I really don't want to do this, but they're still going to do that. And we see that in the women who come into our shelter, right? They've been abused for so long that their self-confidence is at the lowest of the low. They don't feel completely human anymore. And so they very much are at risk of being taken advantage of. They're very vulnerable, that they could engage in a new relationship that will again be unhealthy, right? And women have learned to fawn as a coping mechanism to try and prevent more harm from happening to them. If I'm submissive, if I am quiet, if I don't challenge, if I don't say what I think, maybe that will lessen the abuse that I'm experiencing.
So we have our lens on, we've got our glasses, we're starting to understand now what we're seeing, and understanding that the person that I'm talking to is dealing with something and has some trauma. How do I support that person in the moment?
It is so critical to be where that person is at and to start where they are. We have women and kids that come into the shelter. If we told them, you must do this, and this, we're not going to get anywhere. That woman is not going to have success. We need to be empathetic, compassionate, active listeners to her story. And we need to start there, right? And build trust and build a healthy relationship with her. We're all interacting with people that may not have ever had a healthy relationship in their lives. They don't even know what that looks like. They don't know what it means to be treated with respect and dignity. It is vital that we have respect and dignity for people, that we remember trauma when we are interacting with people. So when we come back for the next episode, we're going to be talking about how you de-escalate some of those situations that you might be faced with someone who is getting heightened in their trauma. And so we really look forward to our folks staying with us for our next series. And let's continue the conversation and grow and learn together. So we will see you for the next episode on trauma. Thank you.